Welcome to DIY Easy Crafts and BergKnifemaking.com. Today we're going to take a look at and do a product review on Rob Carper's Davy Jones Locker knife scales. Now these are custom knife scales that Rob makes, and he uses an assortment of shark teeth, coral, and seashells embedded in alumilite, an alumilite casting. So in this video, I want to do a review of the scales, but I also want to take you through the whole shaping and polishing process. Now, Rob Carper makes an assortment of really exotic knife scale material. Very sought after. It's very hard, very durable, polishes really easily. I've used a number of his scales on my projects for probably the past 6 to 8 months, and I've been very pleased with every single one of them. I'm especially fond of his turquoise and wood burl combinations. They just really end up looking nice on my knives. But on today's video, like I said, we're gonna take a look at this coral, shark tooth, and seashell scales, and he makes these with an assortment of different shapes and sizes of shark teeth and colors, as well as a variety of different seashells, and also a variety of coral. And he actually casts these in alumilite, then cuts them into blocks or scales. This is what you get. Now you can get these as an individual piece, or you can get them cut in half already into 2 separate scales. For this project, and I'm actually going to be working at 2 knives at the same time, I'm going to glue this scales right onto a blue liner. The first step in the process is I really want to just sand that entire back surface of the scales completely flat. The couple of pieces that I got, the corners lifted a little bit, so if I really want to get a good flat edge, especially when attaching to a knife or to the liners, you want to take off a little bit of material from the back. The next step is just to scruff up both sides of the liner material so you get a good adhesion with the 2-part epoxy. I usually also wipe that down with rubbing alcohol, and I'll also rub down the back of the scale material with the same rubbing alcohol, just to get rid of any grease that could, possibly cause any adhesion problems. Now, I use a 2-part epoxy. I think it's DevCon. It's a 24-hour set, and I just put glue on both pieces. I put it on one side of the liner. I put it on the back side of the scales. I've got the liner resting on a wood board, flat board, with parchment paper, so that nothing's going to stick to that board. And then you could clamp this down. I just find that using 2 or 3 bricks or pavers works very well, very easy. These are actually pavers that were left over from my patio. The top one is really doing all the work. The side ones just prevent it from sliding off out of position. So once that's dry, this is what you get. Liner firmly attached to the back of the scales. And now we can really start to work on the knife scales. So first off, I usually cut my scales, especially the wood ones, out all of the trimming on a pin saw. The pin saw just doesn't cut through this coral very well at all. So I did the trimming work and cutting this, this particular block in half on a bandsaw, a metal cutting bandsaw. I'm then going to mark basically where I want the knife blade handle to be on the scales, and then also what shape I want that leading edge to be. So there's 2 variations of this. You can just mount the scales directly to the knife, or if you're going to attach bolsters, you would attach the bolsters first and then match up these scales to fit perfectly into the bolsters. And I'm going to show you both types here. So for this particular handles that I'm working on now, the scales that I'm working on, I just went back to the grinder, and with a coarse grit belt, I'm going to just rough shape that leading edge, or that forward edge. You not only want to get the rough shape, but you also want to go through the belts I think I started at a 60 grit. You want to go to 80, 120, 240, 1000, and if you can, 1200 or 2000. And then you want to polish it. And you always want to polish that leading edge before you attach it to the knife blank, because once it's attached, it's really difficult to polish that leading edge without damaging the blade. Now, one of the ways you could do it on a buffing wheel, I like to use the 2x72 as much as possible. So I have a felt belt that I put on my, this is an Oregon blade maker, or an Origin blade maker 2x72. It's variable speed, which comes in real handy. Using a little compound. And this is really the first test of how well or how easily these Rob Carper Davy Jones locker scales polish up. Now, I sanded these down to 1200, not spending a lot of time, just a quick 1200. And then I'm only hitting them for another few seconds on the felt belt, letting that polishing compound do its work. And that's all it takes. So you can see the front of those scales are polished. You can see translucent right through them. And these are now ready to be mounted onto the blade. So I've covered mounting knife scales on a variety of different videos. I do it a little bit differently than most people do. I'll glue one half of the scales onto the blade, positioning it exactly where I want it to be, clamping it into that position, and then once it's dry, I use the pre-drilled holes through the handle of the blade as my guide, and I drill holes through that first scale. Then I glue the second scale on, again positioning it exactly where I want, and when that's dry, I use the pre-drilled holes through the first set and the tang of the knife as the guide for drilling through the second set. It sounds complicated, but it's really not. And basically the end result is that that drill bit goes straight through all three pieces on the final pass, and you end up with aligned holes with no wiggle and no wobble. You get a nice tight fit with the pins. I'm not going to show you that entire process. Like I said, I've done a multitude of videos that depict that. What I'm doing here is I'm just clamping that first half of the scale material onto the blade. I positioned it where I want it to be. And then anytime you're gluing scale material with epoxy, keep a little bottle of rubbing alcohol, and you can just clean up any additional or residue epoxy that squeezes out from between the scales and the blade. And you can also take a good look at the blade itself and clean up any little smudges caused by the epoxy with that rubbing alcohol. It's much easier to clean it off now while it's wet than waiting for it to dry. So now I'm going to move ahead. This is actually a different knife. This particular knife has stainless steel bolsters. They're dovetail bolsters. And I've already aligned both of the scales, glued them on, pinned them in place with epoxy. This particular knife has the exact same blue liners, and we're just going to continue the video on a different blade. First step is I'm going to grind down the excess pin material, which is protruding from both sides of the handles. You want to be careful here. You want to use a coarse grit belt, and you want to quench the handles in water very frequently. Even though this alumilite material is very heat resistant, I just don't want to take any chance at all of damaging the scales, especially with the heat created on those stainless steel pins. Now at the same time, I'm also reducing the thickness of the scale material, in this case right down to about 1/4 of an inch, which is the thickness of the bolsters. And I'm doing this on a coarse grit belt. Coarse grit belts will generate less heat, but the downside is they will leave deeper scratches. So I don't want to bring it right to size. I want to bring it just a little bit oversized. And then I'll go through the belts. So I'll move down to a 60 grit and then an 80 grit. And eventually a 120 and probably a 240. While I've got the 60 grit in the 2x72, I'll throw a 90-degree tooling rest in, and I'm going to profile the handles to match the profile of the blade. This is a very fast process. I'm using the flat of the handles or one side of the scales, and you can almost hear when that belt starts to hit the stainless. And it goes through the scales and starts to hit the stainless. And again, during this entire process, you want to quench frequently so that you don't generate too much heat. Don't forget that if you heat these things up too much, you're going to lose the adhesion with that two-part epoxy. Now, all of the grind lines that I'm generating now are going to be horizontal. When I do a cleanup later on, I'll go vertical and get rid of all of those lines with a finer grit belt. To do the inside curves, I can let the belt overhang a little bit on the right side of the platen. Gives it kind of a softer edge. But this is very rough. I'm not trying to end up with a finished product on this belt. Just trying to get rid of the bulk of the material, of the excess material. Now I got rid of that 60 grit. I think I'm on either the 80 or the 120 now. And I'm going to go back over the spine. I'm going to go back over both flats on either side of the handles. Just like you would working any scale material. Now I also try to utilize that 2x72 to round over as much of the scale material and the bolsters as possible. I just gently roll. I keep a real close eye on the belt and on the blade. I don't want to touch that blade to the belt at all. You would ruin a knife very, very quickly. You have to be careful. This is a small wheel attachment for the Origin blade maker, and this really comes in very handy. And again, you have to run through the grits on it. So I'm going to get rid of all of the horizontal grind lines from doing the rough profiling work on the bolsters and on the scales. And this is probably an 80 or 120 grit. I'm going to get rid of all of those horizontal lines. Then you have a couple choices. I do some of the shaping just with an Orbital Sander. I start with an 80 and I go then to a 220 grit. And I just break that edge and I start to round over the corner so that the handle actually fits nicely into my hand and is comfortable in my hand. Again, I'm not finishing it with this. This is just one of the tools. If you don't want to use an Orbital Sander, you can use a Dremel grinder. You can use a small wheel attachment on the 2x72. Whatever you use, just be careful that you don't inadvertently scratch the blade. The next step is everybody's favorite, a little hand sanding. I like to roll the sandpaper, in this case this is a 80 grit, around a wooden dowel, and that allows me to get into some of the curves and also apply a little bit of pressure. And I'm really just working not on the flats of the handle, but just on that inner edge, rounding it over so that it's comfortable in your hand. And I'll do that with the 80, and then I'll go to a 220. I'm also going to hand sand flat, and I hand sand perpendicular to the vertical grind lines that I was creating on the 2x72. And the reason for that is when you change direction of the sanding, you will highlight any deeper remaining scratches that are vertical. Now, I'm showing the hand sanding. I'm not spending a tremendous amount of time hand sanding. This material sands very nicely. I do then, after I stop with the 220 on the block, I'll go to just hand sanding with just my fingers. This is a 500 grit. Then I go to 1,000 grit, and then I very quickly polish it to 2,000 grit. And that's important. You really want to get off any existing scratch marks. If you can do it down to 2,000, the polishing process just becomes super easy. So the last two steps, I know it's a fairly long video, but just basically it's how long it takes. I went back to the 2x72 as my origin blade maker. 2x72, I've got the felt belt on it again with polishing compound, and I'm just going to give it a quick polish. I use it at a slower speed. I'm probably at about 40-50% right now, and it doesn't take long. This is really nice for polishing the flats. And sometimes you do have to polish these things a couple times. Sometimes you'll polish it and you'll find a couple scratches in the bolsters or a couple of deep scratches that you missed, and you just have to go back a couple of grits, get rid of those, and then redo the process. Each time you do that, it takes far less time because you're only getting rid of one scratch or one area. And then the last step, after polishing it on the 2x72, that's already pretty well polished. I'm just going to go over to the buffing wheel. And the buffing wheel is a very, very light touch, also with compound, to polish the alumilite or the rod Carper scales. The stainless, you have to give a little bit more pressure, but the scale material itself, a very light touch. I have to say that these scales were an absolute pleasure to work with. The end result is stunning. They're absolutely translucent, clear. You can really see the seashells and the shark teeth and the coral better than I expected it would come out. If you want to see any of the other Rob Carper creations, he's on robcarperinnovations.com. I highly recommend his product. It's just super easy to work with, and the end result is really stunning. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. By all means, join us on the web and on our Facebook group, Knives and Knife Making, and check out my own knife creations at bergknifemaking.com. Thank you very much.